The silence in the cabin was a physical thing, as heavy and as cold as the iron stove that stood dormant in the corner. Finn felt it press against his chest, a weight that had settled there 3 winters ago and had only grown heavier with each fall of snow. Outside, the world was a void of white, the pines burdened and bowed, the mountains surrendering its sharp edges to a soft, unforgiving blanket. The house was a reflection of the man inside it, large, quiet, and shuttered against the world. Dust motes danced in the thin shafts of winter light that pierced the grimy window panes, illuminating the neglect. A plate with the petrified remains of a day-old meal sat on the table, a testament to an appetite lost to something far deeper than hunger. He was a huge man, built of the same rugged material as the mountains that cradled him, with a tangle of dark hair and a beard that fell to his chest. But the strength in his frame felt hollowed out, the sinew and muscle a shell around a core of profound emptiness. He had built this place with his own hands for her, for Mary, and now every beam and plank was a monument to her absence. The silence was her ghost. He could no longer bear the taste of his own cooking, the lonely ritual of charring meat over a fire he barely had the will to build. It was a failure of the body that finally moved him, a gnawing in his gut that wasn't grief, but simple animal need. He could face a blizzard, a bear, a season of starvation, but this slow, quiet decay from the inside out was a different kind of enemy. He needed help. The thought was foreign, a splinter under his skin, but it was there, and it would not be ignored. Someone to manage the hearth, to fill the house with the scent of food instead of sorrow. Someone to break the suffocating stillness. He stood, his great frame casting a long shadow in the dying light, and pulled on his thickest coat. The decision felt like cracking ice, a painful shift toward a current he had long resisted. He would go to town. The settlement of Jasper Creek was little more than a muddy street clawed from the wilderness, a place Finn visited only when necessity screamed louder than his desire for solitude. The journey down from his ridge was arduous, the snow deep and clinging, but the physical exertion was a welcome distraction from the noise in his head. In town, the looks he received were familiar, a mixture of fear and curiosity directed at the wild man from the high peaks. He ignored them, his focus singular as he made his way to the general store, the bell above the door announcing his arrival with a jangling cry. The air inside was thick with the smells of coffee, cured leather, and damp wool. Mr. Henderson, the proprietor, gave a nervous nod from behind the counter. Finn bought his supplies with curt, single-word answers, his gaze sweeping the room. Pinned to a rough-hewn community board was a small, handwritten notice. The script was neat, precise, unlike the usual scrawls. Cook and housekeeper seeks position. Hard worker. Honest. Inquire within. Henderson followed his gaze. That's the Chinese woman. Her husband passed working on the railroad last fall. She's been taking in mending, but it's not enough. Lives in that little room behind the laundry. Finn stared at the notice for a long moment. An outsider. A woman adrift, just as he was. Perhaps her silence would understand his. He found her in a room that smelled of lye soap and steam. She was small, fine-boned, and wore a faded prairie dress that hung loosely on her frame. Her dark hair was pulled back in a severe knot, and her eyes, when she lifted them to meet his, were deep and still, holding a sorrow he recognized. He was a giant in her small space, his head nearly brushing the low ceiling. Words felt clumsy, oversized. You need work, he stated. It was not a question. She simply nodded, her hands clasped before her. I am on way. Her voice was soft, a low murmur. I can cook, he said. Keep the house. It's quiet on the mountain. He watched for a flicker of fear, of hesitation. There was none. only a quiet assessment. "I will work hard," she promised. The terms were settled with the same economy of language. A small wage, a room of her own, passage to his cabin. He was hiring a cook. But as he looked at this woman, lost and alone in a foreign land, he felt he was doing something more, though he did not yet have the words for what it was. Her arrival at the cabin was as quiet as the falling snow. An-Wei carried a single, cloth-wrapped bundle that held all her worldly possessions. Finn led her inside, the oppressive silence of the main room rushing to meet them. He felt a sudden, sharp shame at the state of the place, the dust, the cold hearth, the lingering scent of neglect. He showed her the kitchen, a space that had once been the heart of the home, now just a collection of cold iron and unused utensils. Then he gestured to a small room off the main living area, the one that had been for storage. "This is yours." It was sparse, containing only a narrow cot and a small crate for a table, but the window looked out over the eastern valley, where the sun would rise. She gave a slight bow of her head, a gesture of acceptance that was both formal and graceful. He left her to settle in, retreating to the far side of the room with the awkwardness of a man unaccustomed to sharing his space. He did not know what to do with himself, so he sat and watched the fire he had built, a silent, hulking guardian of his own misery. Soon, however, a series of small, purposeful sounds began to emanate from the kitchen. The gentle clink of pottery, the swish of a broom against the floorboards, the pump of the handle for water. These were not intrusive noises. They were the sounds of life being breathed back into a dead space. Later, a scent began to curl through the cabin, something savory and warm, laced with ginger and herbs he couldn't name. It was a fragrance so wholly different from the simple fare of his past that it felt like a message from another world. When she called him to the table, he saw it had been wiped clean. A bowl of steaming broth with tender vegetables and strips of dried venison sat before his place. He ate without a word, the warmth of the soup spreading through his chilled body. It was more than food. It was a kindness, a quiet offering in the face of his immense solitude. An-Wei ate at the other end of the table, her own movements deliberate and silent. The silence between them remained, but it had changed its texture. It was no longer the hollow silence of absence, but the watchful silence of two solitary souls occupying the same fragile space. The days fell into a rhythm dictated by the winter sun and the quiet domesticity An-Wei brought to the cabin. While Finn was out on his trap lines, his snowshoes sinking into the pristine powder, she was a quiet force of transformation within the four walls of his home. He would return at dusk, stomping the snow from his boots to a world remade. The floors were swept clean, the windows washed to a startling clarity, and the fire in the hearth was no longer a sullen ember, but a bright, roaring blaze that threw dancing shadows on the walls. The cabin, which had been his tomb, was slowly becoming a shelter again. The scent of her cooking greeted him from 100 yards out, a warm, inviting beacon in the frozen landscape. She was resourceful, turning his stores of dried goods and salted meats into dishes he had never imagined. There were savory stews, delicate rice dishes, and breads that filled the air with the scent of yeast and hope. He found himself looking forward to meals, not just for the sustenance, but for the ritual of sitting at the clean wooden table and partaking in something made with such care. He watched her as she worked, her movements economical and precise. She mended his worn shirts with stitches so fine they were nearly invisible. She organized the pantry, her small hands bringing order to his chaos. She never sang, never hummed, but her presence was a kind of quiet music that filled the spaces his grief had emptied. One afternoon he found her standing before the small, unadorned shelf where Mary's few books remained. She was not touching them, merely looking, her head tilted in contemplation. He remembered Mary reading aloud by the fire, her voice filling the cabin with tales of faraway places. The memory brought a familiar ache, but it was softer now, less of a jagged edge and more of a dull, persistent throb. He thought of the silence that had followed that voice, a silence so profound he thought it would swallow him whole. Now there were other sounds, the soft chop of a knife on a wooden board, the whisper of her slippers on the floor, the gentle clatter of a spoon against a bowl. These were the sounds of his life now, and he was surprised to find they did not feel like a betrayal of the past, but rather a tentative step toward a future he had long since abandoned. A blizzard descended upon the mountain without warning, a furious squall of wind and snow that erased the world beyond the windows. For 3 days they were sealed inside the cabin, the wind howling a mournful song around the eaves. The enforced proximity shifted the careful distance they had maintained. The cabin, which had begun to feel warm and ordered, now seemed to shrink around them, making their shared silence more potent. Finn spent the time oiling his traps and sharpening his axe, tasks that required focus but not thought. An-Wei sat near the fire, her hands busy with a basket of his socks, each one receiving her meticulous attention. On the second day he saw her gaze drift again to the bookshelf. He felt an uncharacteristic impulse to speak, to bridge the quiet gulf between them. He cleared his throat, the sound unnaturally loud in the room. "My wife, she liked the stories." His voice was rough from disuse. An-Wei looked up from her mending, her dark eyes holding his for a moment. "They are good company," she said softly. Her simple statement held a world of understanding. He nodded, unable to articulate the sudden tightness in his chest. Later he noticed the way the firelight caught the silver threads in her dark hair, and the weary lines etched around her eyes. She was not so different from him. She too was a survivor of a great storm, left stranded on an unfamiliar shore. He wondered about the husband she had lost, the life she had left behind, the dreams that had turned to dust on this cold, hard continent. The questions rose in his mind but died on his lips, trapped behind the wall of his own reticence. That evening, as the storm raged its fiercest, the last of his cured tobacco ran out. A familiar restlessness set in. He stood and paced the small space, a caged animal. An-Wei watched him, her expression unreadable. Then she rose and went to the kitchen. She returned with a steaming mug. It was not coffee or tea, but a fragrant, spiced broth. "It will warm you," she said, her voice barely a whisper above the wind. He took the mug, his large, calloused fingers brushing against hers. The contact was fleeting, but it sent a jolt of warmth through him that had nothing to do with the hot liquid. It was the first time they had touched. When the storm finally broke, it left behind a world transformed, sculpted in drifts of brilliant white under a painfully blue sky. The air was sharp and clean, and as the sun climbed higher, the first signs of a thaw began. Water dripped steadily from the eaves, a slow, rhythmic percussion that sounded like the ticking of a clock marking a new time. Inside the cabin, a similar shift was occurring. The intense confinement of the blizzard had altered the atmosphere between them, leaving behind a fragile awareness. The silence was still present, but it was now threaded with a new kind of attention. Finn found his eyes drawn to her more often, noticing the small, graceful details of her existence. The way she tucked a stray strand of hair behind her ear, the focused intensity of her expression as she stirred a pot. He began to speak more, not in long conversations, but in small offerings of information. "The snow will be heavy in the lower passes," he would remark, or, "Saw coyote tracks near the creek this morning." They were simple facts about his world, but they were invitations. She would respond with a quiet nod or a soft, "Be careful." One afternoon, returning from his trap lines, he found a small, resilient green shoot pushing its way through the melting snow near the edge of the woods. It was the first sign of spring, a promise of life returning. On impulse, he carefully dug it up, roots and all, and carried it back to the cabin. He found an old tin can, filled it with dirt, and planted the shoot. He set it on the windowsill in the kitchen where the afternoon sun was strongest, saying nothing. He did not know why he had done it. It was a foolish, sentimental gesture, the kind of thing he thought had been buried with Mary. When Anway saw it, she stopped her work and went to the window. She looked at the small green plant for a long time. Then she turned to him, and for the first time he saw the ghost of a smile touch her lips. It was a small, hesitant thing, but it was enough. It was a beginning. "It is beautiful," she said, her voice soft. "Thank you." In that moment, the cabin felt warmer than the fire could ever make it. The thaw accelerated, and the mountain began to shed its winter coat. The sound of melting snow became a constant murmur, the gurgle of unseen streams coming back to life. The change in the season seemed to demand a change in him. One afternoon, while splitting logs, the axe slipped. The blade bit deep into the side of his calf, a flash of searing pain followed by the immediate, shocking well of crimson against the white snow. He swore, leaning heavily against the woodpile, the world tilting for a moment. He managed to limp back to the cabin, leaving a trail of red behind him. Anway was there in an instant, her composure absolute. Her face was pale, but her hands were steady as she helped him to a chair. "Sit," she commanded, her voice firm with a quiet authority he had never heard before. She moved with practiced efficiency, fetching clean water and strips of cloth. She knelt before him, her touch surprisingly gentle as she cleaned the wound. He watched her, mesmerized by the focused calm in her expression. Her proximity was unnerving, her scent, a clean, subtle mix of soap and wood smoke, filling his senses. When she looked up to check his face for pain, her dark eyes met his. The world seemed to fall away, leaving only the two of them in the quiet cabin, the fire crackling in the hearth, her small, warm hands resting on his injured leg. He had been so long without gentle touch, so long without care, that the simple act felt overwhelmingly intimate. A profound tenderness washed over him, a feeling so potent it almost frightened him. It was more than gratitude. It was a deep, resonant ache in his chest, a recognition of the woman before him not as his cook, not as a fellow survivor, but as a source of impossible warmth in his frozen world. She finished binding the wound, her work neat and secure. Her hands lingered for a second longer than necessary. "You must rest it," she said, her voice returning to its usual softness. He could only nod, his throat too tight for words. The physical pain in his leg was a dull throb, but it was nothing compared to the powerful, unfamiliar stirring in his heart. The wound would heal, but he knew, with sudden certainty, that something inside him had been irrevocably changed. His injury forced a new kind of stillness upon him. Confined to the cabin, he watched Anway more closely than ever, his world shrinking to the scope of her movements. He saw the deep grace in her everyday tasks, the quiet dignity she carried like a shawl. He began to notice the things she needed but would never ask for. The stool she used in the kitchen was wobbly, so he spent an afternoon patiently sanding and bracing it until it was solid and steady. He saw her squinting in the dim evening light as she mended, and the next day he fashioned a small stand for a second oil lamp, placing it on the table beside her usual chair. These were his words, his way of speaking the gratitude and burgeoning affection that he could not voice. He was telling her, in the language of wood and work, that he saw her. She accepted these gifts with the same quiet grace she did everything, a soft "thank you," and a look in her eyes that told him she understood his silent vocabulary. One evening the cabin was particularly peaceful. The fire cast a warm, golden glow over the room, and the only sounds were the crackling of the logs and the whisper of her needle through cloth. She sat across from him, the lamplight softening the tired lines on her face, illuminating her focused expression. He watched the way her slender fingers moved, deft and sure. A feeling rose in him, powerful and undeniable, a tide that had been building for weeks. He rose from his chair, his leg barely protesting, and crossed the space between them. She looked up, her hands stilling in her lap, her eyes wide with a question. He knelt before her, just as she had knelt before him when he was injured. He reached out, his large, rough hand trembling slightly as he gently cupped her cheek. Her skin was soft, warm. She did not pull away. She closed her eyes, a small, trusting sigh escaping her lips. He leaned in, his heart hammering against his ribs, and pressed his lips to hers. The kiss was not one of passion, but of profound tenderness. It was hesitant, searching, a question and an answer all in one. It tasted of solitude and sorrow, but also of a deep, burgeoning hope, as fragile and as real as the first green shoot of spring. After that first tentative kiss, the space between them was filled with a new, gentle electricity. The silence that remained was no longer one of solitude, but of comfortable, shared intimacy. They began to talk more, the words coming easier now that the greatest truth had been spoken without them. Sitting by the fire in the evenings, he found himself telling her about Mary, not the pain of her loss, but the joy of her life. He spoke of her laughter, which he said sounded like wind chimes, and the way she had convinced him to build the cabin on this specific ridge because she loved the way the morning sun hit the valley below. Sharing these memories did not reopen the wound. Instead, it felt like letting in clean air. An Wei listened patiently, her presence a quiet balm. In return, she shared pieces of her own story. She spoke of her home in a province by the sea, a place of vibrant colors and bustling markets so different from this stark, monochrome mountain. She spoke of her husband, a scholar who had dreamed of a better life, and the harsh reality they had found instead. She spoke of his kindness and the crushing weight of loneliness after he was gone. They were two solitary figures, their histories scarred by loss, who had found an unexpected harbor in one another. They were mapping the geography of each other's grief, and in doing so, they were discovering a new landscape they could inhabit together. Spring was no longer a promise, but a reality. The last stubborn patches of snow melted away, revealing the damp, dark earth. The trees began to bud, a faint haze of green appearing on the mountainside. The world outside the cabin was reawakening, and Finn felt his own heart mirroring the season. The house was full of light, the windows thrown open to the fresh, clean air. The heavy, oppressive weight that had lived in his chest for 3 years had begun to lift, replaced by a feeling so light and hopeful it felt like a miracle. He had hired a cook to save him from starving, but An Wei was saving him from something far worse. She was teaching him how to live again. One warm meal, one gentle touch, one shared silence at a time. The sun rose over the eastern ridge, spilling liquid gold across the valley. The air was cool and carried the scent of damp earth, pine, and the promise of a warm day. Finn stood on the porch of the cabin, a mug of coffee warming his hands, and watched the world come alive. The mountain was vibrant, clothed in the 1,000 shades of green that marked the full arrival of spring. The roar of the creek, swollen with meltwater, was a constant, powerful murmur in the background. It was the sound of life, loud and insistent. The cabin door opened softly behind him, and An Wei stepped out. She wore one of Mary's old dresses that she had altered to fit her own small frame, the faded calico seeming bright in the morning sun. She carried a steaming cup, not for herself, but for him. He had finished his coffee, but he took it from her anyway, their fingers brushing in the exchange. It was a simple, domestic gesture, one that spoke of a future he had never dared to imagine. They stood together in comfortable silence, watching the morning unfold. There were no grand declarations of love, no promises of forever. Their bond had not been forged with such things. It had been built slowly, quietly, out of shared grief, mutual respect, and the simple, profound kindness of two lonely people finding solace in one another. He set the cups down on the railing and reached for her hand. Her fingers were small in his great palm, but her grip was firm. He looked down at her, at the quiet strength in her face, and felt a sense of peace settle over him, as deep and as vast as the sky above. The silence in his heart, the one that had echoed with loss for so long, was finally filled. It was filled with the scent of her cooking, the sound of her soft footsteps, the warmth of her hand in his. The house behind them was no longer a monument to a ghost. It was a home, alive with the steady, gentle rhythm of a new beginning. He squeezed her hand, and she squeezed back. It was enough. The mountain held them, and the spring had, at long last, come.